Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. We have a packed schedule today, so I don't want to waste any time at all. We have phenomenal speakers here for you. My name is Michelle Ekstrom. I'm the Education Director at the National Conference of State Legislatures, and today we're super excited to have a large group of legislators and staff joining us for this discussion on school choice in the pandemic. We have great experts to join us to talk about a variety of topics that I'm sure are also being discussed in your state. So just a reminder of the protocols for today's virtual meeting. Please be sure to join us by video and turning on your camera if at all possible. We love to see your faces and we love to know who's joining us. And to that end, please be sure that your name is fully showing, and if you want to add your state too, that might also help. And you can change that by clicking on the three dots in the upper right hand side of your tile. And be sure to keep yourself on mute while the speakers are speaking, but there will be time when we'll ask you to unmute and share your questions. You can also be sure to just type those in the chat box too. We definitely want to know what your questions are to make sure that you are getting the information that you need during this presentation. And we'll try to get to as many of those as possible, and any that we're not able to get to, we and our group of experts will also follow up with you to answer those questions. Because we have screen sharing going on with all of our speakers, we're just going to ask you to be sure to not click anything to share your own screen. Because we don't want any accidental screens to be shared. So make sure that you don't do that. And just a reminder that this meeting is recorded. We want to share this with others who aren't able to join us today. And the archive and the slides will also be posted on NCSL's YouTube channel, as well as on our website on our school choice page. So to get us started today, we wanted to ask you some questions, and we're going to ask you to respond in the chat box. So we'd like to know what your name is, what state you're from, and what is the most pressing concern about the impact of the pandemic on education broadly, and how does school choice fit into that context? Is school choice helping in this situation? Is it a hindrance? What is your particular concern about school choice? What is your unique challenge or success as a result of the pandemic? So we'll give you just a moment to do that. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll be scrolling through those responses so that we can read them, our speakers can read them, and others can read them as we're going through the meeting. So I wanted to review the agenda for today's meeting. We'll start off from 2 to 2:35 with the discussion about parent views on education and school choice with Paul DePerna from EdChoice. Then we'll transition to a discussion about the impact of the pandemic on charter and private schools. And joining us will be Mike Petrilli from the Fordham Institute and Bruce Hermie from the American Federation for Children. Then we'll take a short break, and then we'll reconvene and discuss state policies to improve school choice as a result of the pandemic. Dale Chu, who will be joining us, just released a paper on this topic with 8 specific recommendations. And Hallie Faulkner and Paul DePerna will be joining us from the American Federation for Children and EdChoice again to continue that discussion, to reflect on what we heard, to see if they have any additional considerations, and to hear from you all about this issue too. And then we'll wrap up as well. Just a reminder that we did share a lot of resources in the most recent reminder about the meeting. So we would encourage you to revisit that list of resources that we have gathered for you, which includes some of the materials from the speakers. We will be sharing out both the recording of the meeting, as well as those resources back out to everyone who has registered for the meeting, so that you have all of them and can easily access them. So at this time, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to ask my colleague, Benjamin Olnick Brown, who oversees our work on school choice, to join us. And Benjamin is going to lead the conversations for the first part of the meeting today.
I think I'm unmuted now and hopefully sharing my screen as well. And thank you, Michelle. We are very excited to have this meeting. My name is Benjamin Olnick Brown. I'm a research analyst in NCSL's education program, and I focus on school choice and school safety, among other K-12 education issues. One of the questions we've heard throughout the past several months repeatedly from our members is a lack of information about how families are doing right now, how families are feeling about closed schools, virtual learning, the choices that are available to them and their children in education. And so we thought a good way to start out this conversation was to bring in an expert to help us answer these questions. Paul DePerna is the Vice President of Research and Innovation for EdChoice. EdChoice is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that researches and advocates for school choice policies at the national and local and state levels. EdChoice's research team produces material that serves as a really invaluable clearinghouse for people like me and policymakers, researchers around the country. And a lot of that is because of Paul's work. Paul has been with EdChoice since 2006, and in that time they've published over 100 papers and reports on this issue, focusing in large part recently on public opinion, school choice, and education. So we are really excited to hear from Paul on these issues and the research that they've been doing recently. So I will stop sharing if I can, and turn it over to Paul.
Thanks, Benjamin. And I will now share my screen with everybody. So yeah, thanks Benjamin and Michelle and NCSL for inviting EdChoice to present the latest findings from our tracking poll. And we've been doing, as Benjamin mentioned, we've been doing surveys for quite a while now, and doing national surveys for about 7 or 8 years. And so, but research is just one aspect of what we do. And so just to take a moment to follow up Benjamin's great introduction, EdChoice is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that has principles rooted in the belief that it's important to empower all families with educational options, that it's a pathway for successful lives and a stronger society. We're based in Indianapolis, but the scope of our work can be national, regional, or having a concentrated focus on a single state educational environment. And so we educate policymakers and our local and state partners through different areas, including training and outreach, communications and marketing, focused state investments, legal, defense, and education, and then my team's area, which is research. And so for about 10, 11 years, EdChoice's core research activities have involved exploring questions around K-12 school choice issues by way of surveys and polling. And also we do a lot of fiscal analyses as well at the state level. And we do other types of empirical data collection, particularly on school choice programs around the country. EdChoice is a charter member of the Transparency Initiative that's led by the American Association for Public Opinion Research. And so at the beginning of this year, EdChoice and Morning Consult, which is a survey research company and data intelligence company, we launched a new monthly tracking poll together that focused on K-12 education and schooling topics. And in mid-March, as lockdowns and school closures started to ramp up because of the coronavirus pandemic, we decided to include a handful of questions to learn how the pandemic and COVID might be affecting public opinion on education questions and particularly parent opinion on different education and schooling questions. And so in a couple minutes, I'll show you some of the things that we've been learning over the last 9 months. And so just to give you a sense of the scope of our project, we're administering a monthly tracking poll by way of online survey. And for any given month, we're obtaining approximately 2,200 general public respondents for our nationally representative sample. And then starting last month in September, we increased our sample of parents of K-12 school-age children to more than 1,200 school parents, and we'll continue to have that large sample month to month. And so the national sample is adjusted to be matched as closely as possible to a range of demographic benchmarks that's provided by the U.S. Census Bureau. And it's a statistically representative national sample. And so again, all that information just to give you a scope of the polling that we've been doing recently. And so now I'd like to quickly show you how you can access our public opinion tracker site, as well as the individual state dashboards where you can get your state specific polling information. And so what I have here is just a screenshot here of this is the national dashboard. The homepage is the national dashboard. And up here you can see, and there are so on the dashboard, there are roughly close to a dozen different sections of results. And then what would be, I think, of most interest to all of you, and hopefully can be helpful to you, would be to click on the state results tab here, and then you can go to your individual state. And here we have, as an example, Ohio. It gives a sample size. It's a rolling average that we are accumulating sample every month. And so eventually it will become a 12-month rolling average based on a state-specific sample. And so in Ohio, we had about 658 through August. And so these are the results that are currently live on the website are through August. And then the parent sample is at 143. And then if you and then on the state-specific dashboards will have the same kinds of charts and questions, information about different question results as the national dashboard. And this gets refreshed and updated the first week of every month. And then one other thing that might be of interest is that up here you can download a state brief, and that gets refreshed and updated monthly. And when you click on that download state brief, then you'll have a PDF file. It's a 2-page brief of the latest numbers for your specific state. And so why don't we just go through and see what the tracking poll has been telling us. And so these results are based on our most recent wave that was conducted September 11th to the 17th. And so this is actually a sneak peek and a preview. We haven't actually published these results yet on the Public Opinion Tracker website. We will be doing that in the middle of next week. And so here we asked, excuse me, there we go. Okay, so this is one of the first questions we wanted to ask is just how disruptive coronavirus has been. And you can see that over time, there was definitely a spike from March to April, and then things started to go to calm down a little bit, and it's been plateauing since July or so, where in the community about a third are still saying that the coronavirus pandemic is very disruptive, and a little bit less so at the family household level and their personal routines. And then we asked a question specifically to school parents about how helpful would these different safety measures be for allowing a safe return of students to school. And you can see that looking at cleaning facilities, upgrading air filtration systems, I mean, roughly 40 to 50% believe that many of these actions would be very helpful to ensure safety of the children and of the adults in the schools. And then we wanted to ask a question about COVID-related school funding support, since that's been very much in the news. How are policymakers, legislators, governors going to respond, even at the federal level, going to respond to support schools and families during the pandemic for their educational needs? And so we asked we gave a list of options, and we asked them which of those options would they see as that they would give their support for. And you can see a plurality, about 3 out of 10 of the respondents. And it didn't matter if they were the adults or if it was amongst school parents or non-parents. About 3 out of 10 said the school district should receive about additional funding, whether they're teaching students in person or remotely. But another way to look at that is that about 70% are saying that that there's other aspects to funding that should be considered, and not just an increase of funding regardless of in-person or remote. So it's something to look at, and you can see some of the individual item responses there. In September, as most students are at least online going back to school, if not actually in person, we asked how parents felt the communications were from their schools and districts regarding different aspects of reopening and going back to school. And so these dots represent, and the percentages represent those who are saying that their schools and districts are doing an excellent job. And so we can see here that district schools, about 30 to 35% of those who have children in district schools are saying that their district schools are doing an excellent job. Some differences show up between districts and charters, but generally these are clustering. These differences are not, perhaps this communicating the reopening plan might show some meaningful differences, but for the most part, they're clustering around together. These aren't really statistically significant differences. And you can just kind of ballpark and say that roughly 25 to 35% are saying that their schools are doing an excellent job communicating about different aspects of going back to school. And then a couple months ago, we began asking a question about if the school or district offered virtual learning or remote learning as an option instead of going back to school in person, how likely would they be to take that option? And you can see here that about half would say it's very likely. And and based on some of the reporting that is going on, it does seem that it is pretty high, depending on districts. And this is probably a little bit higher than at least what I expected. But about half said that they would be very likely to take that remote learning option. And then another quarter, 26%, would say they would be somewhat likely. So this is something that we expect some volatility, especially in changes month to month, especially at the beginning of the school year. So we're looking to see what these results will look like in October. And then we just asked if parents think that districts and schools should be offering just one approach or multiple learning options. So we're starting to get into the theme of increased learning options, and we see that 65% say that they would like to have multiple learning options presented to them by their for educating their children. And 24% said that they would be okay and prefer one approach. Learning pods have been in the news a lot going back to the midsummer. And so this is the first, in August, we began asking this question about learning pods. And so learning pods, for those of you who might not be as familiar, these are a response to the pandemic where their parents are getting together and they're forming these small groups of their children organized by parents, and they're gathering to learn and either through usually like a private tutor or a private teacher, but it's all parent directed. And we don't make the distinction in this question, though, whether these pods are occurring outside of the school or in addition to their formal schooling, or if it's substituting for formal schooling. And so what we see, though, is a third of school parents said, yes, we are currently participating in a pod. And then we see that another 20% are looking to form or join a pod. And then looking at the demographics, there has been some concern and writing in different news pieces and op-eds about just potential for more stratification and disadvantaged families falling behind or not having these options. And so we do see right now that there are some demographic differences among parents who are taking advantage of learning pods. And so you can see here that close to half of high income families, those in households of 75,000 or more, are saying that they are participating in a pod. And again, this may be in addition to formal schooling. And even a higher percentage of urbanites are saying, people who say they live in urban areas are taking advantage or participating in pods. And that could be some of these large school districts, as many of you know, and urban districts have yet to even to start, or they won't, or they're not in person at all right now without and not without any plans. For example, in Chicago, my understanding is that they may not go back in person at least until November. And so these pods are another alternative or an option for families to help educate their children. Then we asked a follow-up question about why folks are participating in pods or looking to form pods, and you can see some of these responses, and these are anecdotes, and these are individual responses from people, but they give you a sense and an impression of some of the rationale and the emotion behind some of these decisions, or not, or deciding to stay put. And so they want to really help their children to keep up with curriculum. It's safe and helpful to help my kids study within a tight community of children. Keep my child socializing with other children during the pandemic, all reasons to participate. Others who are looking to form a pod, saying they want their children to have more social interaction. That's tends to be a common theme. Kids are tired of being home, so new location can be helpful, new environment. Being a father of 2 young girls, some of these responses are, they resonate generally, not necessarily specific to learning pods, but I definitely understand where some of these are going. And then why not to participate? They don't feel comfortable about their kids joining a group because of COVID. Which is certainly understandable, and then can't afford the cost if there's a contribution to join a pod. And that some people who have older kids, high schoolers, they can work independently. Maybe they can do fine enough with remote learning through their school or district. And so then we asked a question about tutoring, and to see to what extent parents are likely to seek out tutoring outside of regular school hours. And we see that about close to 30% said that they were very likely to seek outside tutoring outside of the school, and another close to 30% said that they were somewhat likely. So almost 6 out of 10 said they were at least somewhat likely to seek out tutoring this school year. And then along demographic lines, again, we see that the high income households and then the urban households tend to stick out and stand out compared to those other demographics where rural and small town are much smaller proportions compared to urban, and then you see the middle income and low income are much smaller compared to the high income households. And so we asked the question about how have views changed about homeschooling, because to some degree everybody became a homeschooler. I mean, that's been a consistent headline in the news since March. Everyone's a homeschooler to some degree, and so we've been asking this question, and you can see that they're generally, parents are more favorable, at least somewhat more favorable towards homeschooling. 70% said at least somewhat more favorable, 36% much more favorable, and we've been tracking this. We can see that there was a bump, pretty significant bump from June to July. And we see from 25 to 43%, and it's held pretty much steady. It's been declining a little bit the last few months, but still a significant proportion, substantial proportion say that they're much more favorable towards homeschooling now as we navigate through the pandemic. And then these questions, over the next several slides, these questions are ones that we've been asking for a long time in different state level polling and our national polling. And so these are kind of independent of considerations around the pandemic. But we do want to see, like, how, trending this over time, how did things change during the pandemic? And we asked how people feel about K-12 education. Is it going in the right direction or the wrong track? And I'm sure if any of you consume polls like I do, and this is a pretty standard question on different in different areas that's asked in policy and in politics. And you can see that and this is always fascinated me. Around March and April, there was a jump of how people felt. There was much more positive sentiment that was climbing. It was climbing even before the pandemic, but it really went up around April. And so there was kind of a rally around the school effect, perhaps, around the time the pandemic was really hitting families and schools. And so close to half said that at least in their district, they felt things were going in the right direction, but then it started to slide since April down to, it's been fairly consistent the last few months, where about 38% say things are going in the right direction in their district, 35% at the state level, 30% nationally. And that's always a consistent finding, where people are more likely to say things at home or closer to home are going a little bit better than nationally. And that's consistent in different types of questions, but so it's just to give you a sense of the positive sentiment and where it stands in September. Another question we ask, and this is an experiment that we have been doing, where we split the sample and we ask half the respondents their preference. What type of school would you select in order to obtain the best education for your child? And then that goes to half the sample, and then the other half of respondents get this question it's a modified question that clarifies that financial costs and transportation would not be factors. And so you can see on the baseline question, the standard question, the preference is pretty even among parents, where it's 40% say they would choose a regular public school or district school, 35% private school, and then roughly 1 out of 10 would choose homeschooling or charter schools, and then the remainder said they don't know. And then among school parents with that extra language, we see some preference for private school goes to 30%. District schools, it's held consistently at 39%, so roughly 4 out of 10 again. The number for homeschoolers doubles, interestingly, to 16%, and then 9% for charter schools. And there are some differences among the grade span. Parents of K-4 children, middle schoolers, and high schoolers are some slight differences. And so here we ask a question about, we have consistently, and it's something that has been part of the polling that we've always employed, is asking questions about different types of educational choice policies and reforms, and including charter schools, school vouchers, and education savings accounts. And so we always ask a baseline question just based on what they know or have heard from others. What is your view on charter schools? I'm paraphrasing here. And you can see those are the dark green bars here that without a description. And so just at the baseline, about half have say they support charter schools without any more information. But then we do give a description and a follow-up question here. And you can see there's a jump of about 12 points among all adults, or all respondents, from 51 to 63. Among parents, there's a 7-point jump from 62 to 69 once they have a definition and description of charter schools. And we see jumps of varying sizes across different types of demographics. And you can see here among parents, the different parents of school-age kids in different grade spans, and then also among Republicans, Democrats, and Independents. And we take the same approach for school vouchers, asking that baseline question without any description, and then giving a fuller description and definition of the policy type. And about 45% say they support vouchers without any information, but that jumps up to 61% once they do have that information. And then we see among school parents goes up to 71%, and that's consistent with our polling that school parents and respondents, African American respondents, Latino respondents, low-income respondents tend to be, and those demographics are available on our website. I don't have them here on the slide, but they tend to consistently be above the national average in terms of their support for charter schools, vouchers, and other types of choice policies. And then finally, we have this question about education savings accounts, which have been around now for almost 10 years. Arizona being the first state to implement them in 2011, around 2011, 2012. And so we see, again, similar jumps, roughly, again, 45% support jumps up considerably, 21 points to 66 with the description. Among parents, it's almost 3/4 support ESAs as it's described. And that's pretty consistent across all different types of parents of different age kids. And so there is a lot of support once you do give a definition and description of choice policy and reform. There is, majority support for those different types of policies and across a range of demographics as well. And what we've seen over time since we've done since we launched the tracking polls, these numbers are pretty stable over time, and they have fluctuated here and there. And this is available on the dashboards online, but you see it's been pretty stable even through the pandemic, before the pandemic and during. These numbers have not really, they've only wiggled a little bit here and there month to month. And so finally, we also did another experiment on funding. And so we asked if school funding in your state was too low, about right, or too high. And more than half said of adults in the full sample said that it was too low. And then for the other half sample, we give them the statistic for the per pupil spending, per student spending in public schools, the most recent available from the National Center for Education Statistics for that respondent state. And this is a generally consistent finding that we've seen over the years, is that information depresses the response, the too low response. And so here it goes down 20 points. There's a difference of 20 points between those who say too low to both types of questions. And then even among parents, it also goes down 20 points to only 1/4 saying that's too low. And so, and then even a majority among parents with that information say that it's about right. So we know I understand that there's going to be a lot of budgetary considerations next session for a lot of you, and this is going to be an important topic and issue. And what we've seen is, and it will certainly be on the minds of parents and other stakeholders in K-12 education. And so, but these kind of findings do bring some context as to where parents are coming from when it comes to funding. It might not be the amount of funding, it could be how those funds are being spent. And then that's the trend that we've seen, that the gap here represents the difference between the too low responses. Without information is up top, where you can see it's been around 50% or even much higher earlier in the year. And then with information, with that statistic, it's about, it's stayed around about 30 to 40% saying that funding is too low. And with that, I'll quickly just note that these are the links where you can access the Public Opinion Tracker website. And then the second link here is where you're able to download our monthly reports. They're slide decks that are available to the public. And we also include crosstabs for all the demographic results on each of the questions. And then we have the questionnaire too, so folks can see the actual questionnaire and survey that the respondents are moving through as they give their responses. And then this link here at the bottom is where we have all the rest of our research at EdChoice, which we call the research library. And so for any given year, we usually add on about a dozen or more reports and briefs that we try to help inform on the issue and considerations around school choice. And I'll just say thank you again for having me. I really look forward to the conversations, and please feel free to contact me anytime if you have questions or any kind of data requests. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Paul. That is a lot of really fabulous information that we don't always get to see. So we had one question for you that I think you can answer quickly. That came up in the chat, which is whether you have state level data on learning pods at this time. I think you're muted.
Sorry again. No, bad habits are hard to break. Yeah, that's a great question. And so we only recently started asking that in August. And so we have 2 months results. And so any state sample will be very, very small, except for the most populous states in California and New York, Texas. But absolutely, feel free. If there's a specific question and you're interested in demographics for a given question in a given month or over time, we're happy to provide that. I'll just have any caveats about small sample sizes that we may have for some of those questions we've just begun to explore.
Great, thank you. And I think there may be some more questions, and luckily we will hear from Paul again in our final panel, so you will have another opportunity to ask those. But in the interests of time, I think we will move on to our next segment here. And I am excited to introduce to you two fantastic speakers that we have here to discuss the impacts of the COVID pandemic on schools of choice, charter and private schools. And the first speaker we'll have is Michael Petrilli, who is the president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute and a fellow at the Hoover Institution. Fordham advocates nationally and in Ohio for effective and accountable school choice policies and for excellence in K-12 education in every school. Mike Petrilli is Fordham's president, and he is a prolific and highly regarded author on issues of education policy and a leader in building organizations focused on excellence, choice, and accountability in K-12 education. So we're thrilled to have Mike joining us from Ohio. And after he speaks, we will hear from Bruce Hermie, I hope I'm saying that correctly, who is the Director of School Partnerships at the American Federation for Children. AFC works on school choice policies in the States and in Washington, D.C., and works directly with schools and policymakers to implement effective school choice policies. Bruce is a key part of that work, engages directly with schools and families to make the most of school choice policies and school options. He is an educator by trade and a former school principal and administrator, so we are also very excited to have his perspective. So both Mike and Bruce, we will give you each about 10 minutes to respond to a question that I'll pose, and then we'll have some time for discussion. And the question is this: we know that, like every aspect of education, the pandemic has impacted charter and private schools. So we're hoping you can share with us an overview of what you're seeing in the field, on the ground, what's happening as a result of COVID. And we'll start with Mike and then hand it over to Bruce.
Great. Thanks so much, Benjamin. And thank you, Michelle, for the invitation. And great to see everybody. A lot of familiar names and faces. Show us your faces. Come on, people. Put on your videos, right? I know everybody's dealing with crazy stuff. I was a little bit late because suddenly I was drafted to help my son with his gym class, which they are doing remotely. We had to pass a soccer ball with our instep. We did that successfully. Hooray. So there you go. It is really a pleasure to be with you. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know of what's happening out there with public charter schools right now. To be clear, there's a lot we don't know, right? Just as with traditional public schools, it's just all over the map how folks are trying to deal with this. And of course, depends in lots of places what's happening with the coronavirus itself and with the infection rates. But Fordham, we have done some work on this. I'm going to talk about an analysis we did of how some of the leading charter school networks made the shift to remote learning last spring. And then some other things that we've seen from some of the other groups that are out there, and try to paint a little bit of a picture. But very much look forward to the comments and questions afterwards. So first of all, we did release a report called Schooling COVID-19. I just put it in the chat so you can check it out, or the shorter Education Next version. And what we did is we really looked to see what some of the large national charter school networks did last spring. We kept hearing from people that groups like KIPP, Achievement First, Success Academy, DSST, Rocket Ship, Noble, and others just did an incredible job meeting the challenge when suddenly had to shift to remote learning. And so we wanted to understand more about what that was and kind of get it down for the historical record. Did not imagine when we started that project that we would all, so many of us would still be in remote learning mode again this year, but here we are. Some of what they did well was what some other traditional public schools and private schools did well, which was, first of all, make sure that kids' nutritional needs and other needs were met, standing up, school lunch programs and the like. And also making sure that technology got in the hands of families, because all of these groups very much wanted to be able to use an online program to make this work. And they were able to do so pretty well, thanks to being, quite nimble. But there were three things they did that we didn't see as much in traditional public schools. First of all, they reached out to individual students and families on a regular basis. I don't mean the emails that I get 15 million times a day from Montgomery County Public Schools that are these sort of mass emails and hard things to keep up with, but actually picking up the phone and calling parents and or kids and asking how they were doing and checking in on their academic progress. Success Academy famously calling kids twice a day. Incredible. But that's something that other schools could and should be doing, especially when they figure out that somebody's not logging in. We've had this big problem around the country of just missing kids. And be able to find out, troubleshoot, is it technology? Are there other things? What can the school do to help out? The second is to recreate the structure of the regular school day. I think we have seen much more of that this year in the traditional public school sector where people are doing remote learning. But, just saying, look, it's not enough to provide an hour or two of instruction, as we saw in too many places. You got to get it. Make it feel like a regular day. That doesn't mean the kids need to be on Zoom all day long, nor should they be, but it does mean that the expectation is we're doing school. We're going to keep on going. And, if school was 9 to 3 before, that's what it's this time as well as regular grading practices, that we're going to make assignments and they're going to count and we expect you to do them and we're going to grade them because, again, we're going to keep learning happening. And then finally, they really took advantage of the fact that most of them have a common curriculum. And they have a culture where they're used to collaborating and teamwork. And so when they figured out, for example, that they would video record a lot of their lessons, they said, we don't need every teacher in our network to record those lessons. Let's pick the best teacher, the best second grade teacher who's great at teaching math, and have them record the second grade math lessons and use that throughout the network. And then that saves time for everybody else to focus more on individualizing instruction. And that's something that's super powerful. Center for Reinventing Public Education also had a study out there of a sample of charter networks. They found they were much more likely to hold real-time classes. They checked in regularly with their students and again, graded student work rather than doing the pass-fail. Now, fast forward to this school year, at least, to this last month as schools have opened and gotten started. What are we seeing? Well, again, I think because they're nimble and because they're smaller, some charter schools have been able to get started in person in some big cities, even where the districts haven't. In Washington, D.C., for example, many of the charter schools and charter networks started for in-person instruction for special education students and other kids that were particularly disadvantaged. Small groups, not everybody, but saying, hey, we got to get these kids that desperately need the in-person instruction in here. And that puts some useful, helpful pressure on the traditional public schools, on DC public schools, to follow course, which they're now planning to do. I would still say there's a lot of places around the country in big cities, which of course is disproportionately where we find a lot of charter schools, where neither the district nor most charter schools have opened for in-person instruction. For lots of reasons, these are, of course, are communities that have been hit hardest by the COVID pandemic, where parents are most nervous about sending their kids back to school, and where there's still, in some places at least, still some high rates of infection. So, charter schools are facing many of the same challenges as traditional public schools when they're trying to make this decision about whether to open for in-person instruction or not. If they do that, they got to make sure they offer an option for remote learning for students and families that want it. Though, you know, they are certainly working on this question of how to make their buildings safe if they do welcome kids back. Hard to do when you don't get any money for facilities funding, which is the case, as we know, in lots and lots of states. You know, they'd like to go out there and maybe purchase air filters or do more signage, PPE and the rest. They don't have those sort of local tax dollars to rely on, or they don't have bonds and the like to rely on. That makes it tough. Of course, like everybody else, they're trying to make sure they find all the kids, make sure they're participating. And of course, they're worried about impending funding cuts that may be coming if there's not a big relief bill from the federal level. Keep in mind, again, that these are schools that are chronically underfunded compared to traditional public schools, getting about 80 cents on the dollar on average. Varies a lot by state. But, you know, these are already schools that in many places are operating on a shoestring. There are a couple of specific challenges that are specific to the charter school sector and not just other schools. So a couple of things. One is this question around how the funding system is going to work. I know there's a lot of questions about how to hold school districts harmless right now if they can't find kids, if kids have dropped out because they don't have internet access. You know, if suddenly the enrollment drops by 10% or a bunch of parents are redshirting their kindergartners, you know, that this would be a terrible time for that to result in big cuts in state funding. Understand that argument. I think there's a lot of legitimate you know, it's legitimate in many ways, but if the solution is to say, well, we're just going to freeze funding, you know, for all schools, regardless of enrollment, you know, what then happens if some schools actually increase enrollment? And we have seen that there are some charter schools, especially charter schools that have opened for in-person instruction, that very much could and would like to expand enrollment and serve more kids and have the capacity to do that, but can't do that if they're not going to get paid for those students. So that's a real issue. Of course, that's a particular issue as well for the virtual charter schools. And then finally, one new issue that we see percolating in our home state in Ohio, and I suspect it's everywhere, is as districts, as these urban districts start to think about opening up, they say, you know, we can't put too many kids on a school bus at the same time. So we can no longer provide transportation to charter school students or sometimes private school students where that's supposed to be required, even though they're supposed to provide that transportation or are supposed to provide funding if they can't provide the transportation. And that's a huge problem. How are you going to get the charter school kids to school if suddenly those buses are not available, or the districts are saying, look, our kids are going to be the priority. So you can have, you know, the buses will be available to you, you know, between the hours of 11 a.m. and 2 p.m., right? That's not going to work. That's something to keep your eye on. Again, you know, some states felt like they had figured out this transportation stuff, and now we've got a new challenge to worry about. So that's a few of the things that we see out there, and hope, you know, look forward and happy to unpack some of that more in detail after we hear from Bruce. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. That was a great overview of the public charter landscape, and I think Bruce will follow us up and talk more about other schools of choice.
Sure. Thank you, Benjamin. Hopefully you can see this here. Excellent. So I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically. Michael talked about the charter impacts, talk more specifically about private schools and what we're seeing. At AFC over the last about 2.5 years, we put a much bigger emphasis on working with private schools in choice states to help better connect school leaders to policymakers, to share their expertise, ideas, and insights to help form policy, and better helped schools connect to parents who are looking to use school choice initiatives to send their kids to the school of their choice. I kind of identified 5 categories of impact that we're hearing from schools here. You know, the one I think that gets talked about most is enrollment issues amongst private schools. The majority of private schools we've encountered are reporting enrollment losses. We put a survey in the field about a week ago in 6 different states, and of about 250 to 300 respondents we've had, about 53% of those reporting losses in enrollment. Now, that's not the case everywhere. We do have some private schools that, due to the fact they're holding in-person classes, have seen increases in interest in their schools. One of the considerations long-term for some of those private school principals that have seen increases are they've had to hire additional staff, they've had to buy additional supplies, and they're concerned a little bit about, you know, how long will those families that have come to them because their old school option wasn't available in person will stick around long-term. So they're putting a heavy focus on retention there. and trying to shore up any loose ends to make sure that the money they've spent or the teachers they've invested in, still are needed throughout the course of the school year. Some schools that are at capacity and have waiting lists could actually accept more students, but due to social distancing and safety protocol reasons, they're not doing that at this time. Trying to adhere to the common 3 to 6 foot rule that's been implemented in a number of states and a number of places, and trying to keep the kids and the teachers safe when they do return to in-person schooling. That we have seen an increased demand for scholarships for enrollment in private schools, specifically in Ohio and Arizona. Large interest in programs there, parents inquiring for alternative options to send their kids, as a lot of the public schools haven't reopened to in-person instruction full time. Second kind of category here, financial impacts. Everyone talks about enrollment and loss of tuition, but what doesn't get talked about a lot in the private school realm is the fact so many schools lost their spring fundraisers last year. Many of them tried to go digital, hold similar events, didn't find a lot of success from most of the school leaders we talked to. Donations were down, and this is continuing to come into the fall. And that's a concern because though some groups have already reported a large amount of school closures. For instance, I think the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops came out and said 150 Catholic schools have closed in the last calendar year. Some schools that were able to make it back to the fall and reopen are concerned about their vitality as they go through this year, if fundraising streams don't continue to come up and if options aren't given for more support for their school. And this has impacted annual fund giving and other things that schools rely on, private schools rely on to provide for their kids and keep their doors open. They also have the problem with increased costs to comply with cleaning directives and purchasing new machines to sanitize playground equipment, classrooms, and different things. A couple principals we've talked to have seen an increase of over $10,000, which is significant for smaller schools in terms of the amount that they have to invest to meet CDC guidelines and standards being placed on them by the state to be open as they move forward. In terms of academics, obviously there's been a significant reduction in contact time. Even schools that have gone back in a hybrid model, teachers are having to teach half their kids at home in some instances while half the kids are on computer. It's slowing down the process in the room. It's not quite the same environment that's being created. And so contact time is being lost, and that's a concern that's been, shared. An inability to access technology. I'm sure some of you have seen articles of students outside Taco Bell and Starbucks in different places trying to access the internet to get homework done. And there's a great need for devices in a lot of places. Our Nevada state team has actually started an initiative trying to provide computers to families who need those computers for their kids to be able to interact with their schools effectively. Another academic concern, obviously most kids lost at least 9 weeks of schooling last year. So missed standards and competencies simply can't be revisited at the start of this year. They actually have to be introduced and solidified. So that's causing some stress for teachers, students, and administrators and parents to close gaps to get parents and students caught up to maybe where they need to be. And there's conversation about what the best way to do that is. And just, as most of you are aware, some students had no instruction whatsoever from March to August, depending on the ability of the school to pivot, go remote, and to meet the needs of families, especially in lower income areas where devices are an issue. This has been specifically a concern. Lack of access to learning need reinforcements for students who may need reinforcements in reading or math or speech services, or students with special needs. This is a concern of how to meet the needs of those students long-term, and how to do it in a hybrid model in some senses if in-person learning isn't taking place. Staffing impacts are something administrators have on their minds as well. We had a lot of older qualified teachers who may have opted out due to health concerns, and the demands that have been placed on teachers, to teach on a multi-tiered front at the same time, is causing a lot of concern over mental well-being of teachers and burnout issues. I've had a number of principals share with me that, they've had to talk more than one teacher out of quitting on the spot, due to frustration or burnout, and it's happening faster. So that's become a concern. Lack of time for meaningful professional development. Professional development has really shifted for most schools of how to operate in a hybrid model, instruct online as well as in person, or maybe full-time online. So that's eating up professional development time, and schools, may or may not have had the ability to fully put their teachers through all the professional development they would have liked to prior to the start of the year. And then in some schools, due to finances, there has been a reduction in staff, and that's made various things more challenging in terms of providing programs. And obviously, when you have to consolidate classes, sometimes that results in larger class sizes, and teachers and administration, having to make those health guidelines work when students do come back in person with larger classes. Finally, just some other issues. Michael talked about the missing children issue. There are school districts across all models who simply can't find kids that were previously enrolled in their school. And so that's obviously a concern for a number of reasons. And in some places, schools are physically going out and looking for children to make sure that they're okay, and trying to interact with the families to see what they need in order to help them get through this situation here. The last two, are hot conversation topics among school leaders. What is the emotional impact of the COVID closures and reopening on children, especially in the younger grades, primary grades? Those kids are so dependent upon socialization, being around peers, learning in group fashion, that being out of that mold and that kind of daily activity for 6 months in some cases, administrators are seeing gaps that shouldn't be there in a lot of places, and working to close those as fast as they can through, either in-person instruction or online, giving the kids more options to interact with each other, and encouraging parents, to find ways to keep their kids interactive in whatever way they deem safe. And finally, the year-long outlook on what priorities should be for gauging student wellness and growth. Starting to hear a lot of conversation about end-of-year testing, nationally norm tests, and what should be expected or what's best for the kids. There's varying opinions there. Like we talked about, there's some pretty big gaps that were created by the early end of the school year in some places. And so those will be important conversations for educators as they go forward, looking to see in what ways they can best benefit their kids. So those have been some of the impacts we've come across in our conversations with schools, school leaders, and parents who've been out and trying to find the right environment for their kids. Pod learning was touched upon. That's become a hot topic that we're seeing, micro schools as well, and more families trying to take an active interest in that and see what options are available out there. So right now there's definitely a desire. There are websites popping up trying to connect teachers with families that are looking for pod situations in various states and areas, and a lot of educational entrepreneurs who are looking to put together their own micro schools to try to meet the needs of families in their areas right now. So that is just kind of a brief overview of what we're hearing and seeing from our private school partners, and some of the hurdles they're trying to cross as they get these kids back into school and look to meet their needs.
Thank you so much. Again, just a wealth of information and expertise. So I hope that you'll put your questions into the chat box or raise your hand and speak up. But a question that came up as we were getting started that I think is relevant to both of your presentations is about enrollment. Both for charter and private schools, we're seeing real changes in enrollment patterns, whether that be exploding waiting lists for charter schools, especially virtual schools, growth in interest in vouchers or scholarship programs that help families access private schools, or declining enrollment at private schools. And so I guess the question for both of you, and I'll go to you first, Bruce, since we went to Mike first before, is how are school leaders handling these changes in enrollment patterns? What are they saying in conversations with policymakers about these enrollment challenges and how to deal with them?
So obviously for the places where schools are seeing an uptick in enrollment, their focus is more on long-term retention. And they're glad to have the extra students, but keeping them there is kind of the main issue. So opportunities to help parents, when they talk to policymakers, pay for private schools long-term. If school choice exists, how can it be strengthened? If school choice doesn't exist, how can it be established? Those are some initial conversations. On the other side of the coin, where maybe you're seeing decreases in enrollment, those school leaders tend to be putting the focus on redirecting their admissions efforts to show parents, especially if they're in person, why their school is excelling at serving kids in this environment and providing for them. And they're also trying to maximize those school choice scholarships where they're available, and educate parents. That's the number one hurdle in terms of use of school choice scholarships, is educating parents on the nuances of them, to help them understand they are eligible when they are, and what the process is to not only apply to the school, but also apply for those scholarships as they go along.
How about those virtual charter schools?
Yeah, no, that was all really well said, Bruce. Yeah, I think in the charter sector, you know, we just, again, don't know a lot yet about enrollment up or down for the brick and mortar charter schools. You know, I think on the whole, they've been able to do a better job knowing where the kids are and making sure kids are participating. So I don't think they have as many of those enrollment loss problems. Though I'm not, you know, again, it's hard to tell at this point for sure. The kindergarten problem might be a real one in terms of, you know, much lower kindergarten enrollment than you'd expect. It is certainly the case that in several states, there's this real debate happening around virtual charter schools. You know, not surprisingly, a lot of parents, you know, back in the summer, as it was clear that the schools were not going to open in person in their communities, were looking at virtual charter schools. And you know, in some places they were allowed to serve more kids and go over their enrollment caps, and in other places they were not. You know, I think we understand the debate, right? The concern from the traditional school districts was that if these kids left unenrolled, you know, it'd be a big cut in funding. But, you know, there's an obvious counterpoint is that, hey, this is what the families desperately need. They're trying to find a model that's going to work for their kids. And so is there a way to figure this out from a policy level? It's tough, though, because it may mean, you know, if you want to both pay the virtual charter schools for the additional kids and hold the districts harmless, you're talking about paying twice for the same kids. So no easy solutions there. You know, I think, look, I think that issue is going to be with us until, you know, all kids are back in school.
Thank you both. Another question that came up a lot in our we sent a survey to all of our participants asking what they were most concerned about, and the question we saw repeatedly was about exactly what you just started talking about, Mike, the impact of school choice policies on the public school budgets and funding. And so I wonder if you each could speak a little bit to that about how are, given these changes in enrollment, given the impacts of the pandemic, how are your organizations and the folks you work with thinking about the needs that policymakers have to balance the needs of all of our students in the various types of schools going forward into the next budget cycle, which we know will be a challenging one in many states?
Yeah, Bruce, you want to go first?
So I guess the easy answer for me is it's always about the kids and what's best for the kids. I'm an educator. And so when I talk to policy people, you know, regardless of the environment the student is in, I think we need to keep in mind their well-being. And as you run into questions of funding and different things like that, I always like to take the impact with school, or take the perspective with school choice that, you know, the programs vary so widely and are different through all states that, you know, you hope the legislators are taking a look at what the real impacts are in terms of benefit to the kids, and like to put the focus there when we kind of look at it. Michael, maybe you can add some more context to that, but that's always kind of my approach to it.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Look, I think the challenge here is to think about short-term and long-term. I mean, let's hope that we can expect that by next fall, most kids are back in school in physical buildings. Now, that's still not a sure thing. We don't know how the vaccines are going to play out. There's this concern that the vaccine for children is not going to be available until next fall at the soonest. But if the other vaccines come relatively quickly, if educators are prioritized, I mean, it does seem like we should be able to get most kids back in school, or here's hoping. So, you know, I suspect that a lot of the enrollment changes are going to settle down. I mean, none of us know for sure. There's a vigorous debate happening right now. You know, are we going to see the traditional public schools lose lots of kids, or is it going to snap back to the trajectory it was on before? I suspect mostly snapping back. So, you know, I just think that if we can encourage policymakers to think about how to deal with the immediate emergency, and make sure that schools, you know, we want to try to protect, you know, all schools that are doing their best to serve kids, but not put artificial limits on good options for parents, you know. And then, you know, we go back to the more normal debates we have about how to fund our education system.
Thank you both. And I know our speakers in our final panel will continue to touch on these issues that just came up and the policy landscape moving forward through what is, as you said, hopefully no more than one year of life in a pandemic, but even beyond, how this is going to affect the policy landscape and school choice, the role of school choice in that landscape into the future. So I think we are at our break time, so we will be back in 9 minutes at 3:15 Eastern, and Michelle will lead that discussion. Thank you all. Thank you to all of our speakers so far. It's been great.
Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started with our afternoon programming. So if you're joining us back from the break, please go ahead and turn on your cameras so that we know that you are back and join us for this discussion. We are going to be discussing for the next 45 minutes state policies and reforms to improve school choice as a result of the pandemic. Today we have 3 excellent speakers joining us. Advance my slide here. First, we'll be hearing from Dale Chu, who is a senior visiting fellow at the Fordham Institute, who also currently works as an independent consultant, specifically focusing on education programs and policies. Dale has worked for the Indiana and Florida Departments of Education. He's also spent 2 decades generally working on P-12, serving as a teacher, a lead teacher, an assistant principal, a principal, and a consultant in both rural and urban districts. So he has a lot of experience, and he's also formerly a Teach for America Corps member as well. So thank you for joining us, Dale. And then following Dale's presentation, we will have Paul DePerna join us once again from EdChoice. And we will also have Hallie Faulkner from the American Federation for Children join us as well. Hallie is a former teacher who also has her law degree, and she has served in the legal departments in the DC Public Schools and New York City Department of Education, and has also worked as a senior policy analyst with Students First, and then as a program analyst with the Broad Foundation as well. She currently serves as the National Policy Director for the American Federation for Children. So welcome, Hallie, to our discussion. So at this time, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I am going to ask Dale to join us. And Dale, you're free to join your screen or to share your screen for your presentation.
Great, thank you so much. Michelle, good to see you. Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it. When things return to normal, hopefully, we should grab coffee at some point, like you suggested. So great to see so many people here. Let me see if I can do this screen share successfully. Everybody see the screen? Good? All right, excellent. Well, first of all, again, thanks to all of you for having me. And yeah, so like Michelle shared, this is a paper that recently published under the auspices of the American Enterprise Institute, looking at some possible school choice reforms given current circumstances. And so I'm going to spend some time getting into sort of the reforms that I thought sort of aligned very well with current circumstances, but at the same time, let me set the table a little bit to sort of my thinking in terms of where the genesis of this particular paper. So school choice is a topic that all of us have been involved in. From my vantage point, the school choice debate nationally, as well as more and more sort of in states and locally, is sort of stuck in this cul-de-sac, right? We go around and around and around. And I feel like the coronavirus has put this dynamic on steroids. And what I mean by that is those who supported school choice before the pandemic, now they're like, oh, we absolutely need school choice even more now because of, everything that was outlined in the previous panels. Whereas those who were either on the fence on choice or were less inclined to support choice, now they feel like folks who are pushing for choice are taking advantage of an opportunity when our traditional school districts are more vulnerable than ever to push their, the preferred mechanism for education. So around and around we go even faster. At the same time, a lot of the back and forth we've had around choice has really focused on sort of the test-based evidence, right? So what I mean by that is you have one side that says, oh yeah, charter schools don't perform as well on standardized test data compared to traditional schools. Whereas on the flip side, you have folks that say, well, no, I mean, if you look at urban charter schools, they actually do better on average. And so this back and forth. And this is something I think that many of us, if not all of us, have been accustomed to this particular dynamic of the school choice argument. Though for me personally, in the age of COVID, And I should say, I feel pretty lucky. My daughter, who's in kindergarten now, actually is attending an in-person charter school. So we're sort of one of the smaller subsets of families that can have in-person education. But all that to say, in terms of this back and forth and COVID, and we have heard all the data enumerated well in the previous conversations around this, it just feels pretty unsatisfying, right? Like this back and forth, like it doesn't really, I think, get to some of the real questions and conversation that needs to be had on this issue, given sort of where families are nationally, especially at a time of real emergency. So in terms of framing this paper, in my mind, these are necessarily not all of them, but these are some key questions that I feel like have yet to be answered across the board, right? What do communities really need schools to do? Right, set aside the charter versus traditional versus virtual, what have you, versus private. You know, what do communities really need schools to do? And then what kind of choices do parents actually want, right? And I know, for instance, like, heck, I mean, at the charter school where my daughter is right now, a lot of the parents who send their kids there don't even know that it's a charter school, right? So this sort of that level of argument, I don't think necessarily meets the needs of what parents are. And then whatever choices we want to offer or make available to our families, how do we ensure they're viable for them? And then finally, moving beyond backpacks full of cash, and for those of you who might not be familiar with that particular phraseology, it's just the idea that we should think of our students as having backpacks full of cash, and then sort of where they go, that's where the cash goes. I mean, I think that's fine, no problem per se with that particular framing, but sort of looking beyond that particular metaphor or visual, you know, what are the practical implications for choice? I think that's a really, really important question. You know, families right now are facing pretty daunting obstacles. Like I said earlier, I feel pretty fortunate to have my daughter in kindergarten at a charter school. But you know, since last March, when schools closed, to present time, I mean, I think by and large, traditional schools have pretty much said, listen, like, we're doing the best we can. This is not something that we've been accustomed to. We're going to try to provide devices to everybody. We're going to try to make sure we have internet access as much as possible. But please, parents, bear with us, right? We're going to work it out. And, you know, by and large, I think parents have been showing that grace to schools and school districts. But the longer this goes, right, to Mike's point earlier, where we don't know by next fall, we hope it returns back to normal, but the longer this continues, like, what sort of pressures and dynamics does that create, right? I was looking over the introductions many of you put into the chat box, and one of you talked about, I think I've been in Washington State, where because the legislature is all of one particular persuasion, it doesn't seem like any sort of new mechanism of choice are possible. It's interesting. I think I get that. But the longer this continues, right, like, how much, you know, how long are exasperated parents going to sort of like say, okay, I could, you know, we got to have something different. All of which is to say that our education system is pretty ill-suited, I think, for the unique quandaries of COVID-19, right? I mean, there's so many elements to this. Like, I think in an ideal scenario, like, great education happens sort of in the classroom and outside the classroom, but maybe we've learned since last March, like, there's a lot to be desired in terms of remote instruction. And as a parent who had his daughter on virtual all of last spring, I think the mood of this photo was definitely something my daughter felt at various times along the way. So all of that to be said, like, there's more to be desired, you know. So in terms of thinking of all of this, I identified 8 choice reforms. And some of these are new, some of these are old, not necessarily earth-shattering, that I think are worth considering. I say it's certainly not an exhaustive list. Definitely looking forward to what Paul and Hallie have to say as well. But here's something to get us started. With the idea that, like I said, the longer we wait, I think the more potential momentum there is for pushing for something interesting here. So the first is what is known as hybrid homeschooling. And actually, Mike wrote a great paper or a great article on this recently, referring to part-time high school. And just the idea with hybrid homeschooling, I think one of the reasons why this is interesting for those of you who are not familiar with it is that if it hadn't been for COVID, we probably wouldn't even be talking about hybrid homeschooling in the context of traditional public schools being involved. And again, so just the idea with hybrid homeschooling is that there's some sort of blend between homeschool and traditional school. So this could be, for instance, like a 10th grader who attends high school 3 days a week, and then spend the other 2 days off campus engaged in some other type of learning. And again, any sort of combination, permutation that you can imagine gets at this idea of hybrid homeschooling. And I think the innovation here, certainly for the purposes of COVID, is that there's a blurring of the lines between what we think of in terms of traditional schooling, which I think is really a key innovation. Number two, similarly, is this idea of employer-provided early childhood education. And so this idea comes from, I'm sure all of you are familiar with, in the time of COVID, how the need for childcare has taken on greater and greater importance. And previously, when we've talked about early childhood, the conversation has largely focused on sort of duct taping early childhood onto the K-12 system. And Rick Hess at AEI talks a lot about how that particular framing can be problematic for a lot of parents, right? I mean, first of all, if you're a parent of a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, you might be nervous about putting your kid on the bus with a whole bunch of other kids, right? And there's a lot of obstacles in there, whereas this idea of employer-provided early childhood education, if you use, there could be some changes made to the tax code, as well as some support from philanthropy that would allow and that would incentivize employers to provide early childhood education. Some mechanism for that for their workers. And that idea that if the employer is providing it, it's a lot more flexible. And again, you'll see flexibility is the name of the game. Open enrollment number 3, this is probably, I'm sorry, I'm kind of running through these pretty quickly, but sort of the nature of this list here. But certainly you could read more about these. But open enrollment is something that I think probably arguably of the 8 might be the easiest for states as it currently stands, the easiest hurdle to clear. Right now, I think north of 40 states have, I could be misremembering that number, but have some mechanism for open enrollment already on the books. The trick with open enrollment as it stands in these 40 plus states is that there's a lot of undue regulation and barriers in state law. So for example, in the state of Texas, I don't know if we have anyone in Texas on the call, but in Texas, as a student, you can cross district lines, but districts have the freedom, ability to tack on tuition for that. So the idea that, okay, I'm a family, my kids' schools around me are closed, but this neighboring district, I'm allowed to bring my kid across the border, but now I have to pay like $10,000 to get my kid into that school. Right, that right there is a barrier, and you could even argue, even though Texas has open enrollment on the books, it's just too much of a hurdle to overcome. So if states are really interested in sort of expanding this particular form of choice, considering what are the barriers right now and bringing those down could make this much more accessible to families. Number 4, an education appraisal market. This is an idea from Lindsay Burke at Heritage. But essentially the idea for number 4 is that if you think about appraisals, just generally outside of the education space, it's just the idea that you can get an outside independent expert to assess the quality of the product or whatever you are having appraised, right? And if you think about folks just in life who go through appraisal, whether it's appraising your house when you're thinking about selling it or purchasing the house, right? Usually these are done for big budget items. But if you think of education, right, we spend $15,000 per kid over 13 years, 12 years, right? Take that total pot of money. This is one of the largest expenditures families make. But as it stands, there really is no way, if you're a parent, to easily access, like, okay, well, is my kid really getting a good education outside maybe, let's say, the state testing system? And we know there's limitations to that. So her suggestion with number 4 is that states should create a formal mechanism to grease the wheels for parents to get a better sense of how their kids are doing from outside experts. And I think this particular reform, if state testing is canceled again next spring, this particular idea I think gets even more traction, because then you have 2 years then where families don't have an external confirmation of whether the kid's doing well or not, and having a market like this could be one way to get at a solution. All right, number 5, Lindsay also proposed this idea of COVID-19 refunds, right? So there's been a bunch of analysis done on how much remote schooling costs, and if you look at just sort of the various pieces, devices and whatnot, magnified over a year, there really is, it's not even close to the $15,000 we spend per year in this country. All of that said, there are a lot of just frankly political and practical challenges to getting refunds, given the fixed costs that districts have. But if we look forward, right, if the current circumstances continue into 2021, 2022, 2023, maybe there should be a conversation, especially if parents are still expected to be in the driver's seat on their child's education. Maybe they should be able to get access to some portion of the dollars that are provided for their child's education. Number 6, education savings accounts and homeschoolers. As it stands right now, the limited number of states, it's a handful that have education savings accounts. They're not always really helpful to homeschoolers for a variety of reasons. And homeschoolers, those of you who are familiar with the homeschool sector, know that they're pretty wary of touching anything that involves public dollars because of the entanglements that are involved, which actually kind of, I'll bring number 7 into this as well. I think almost half of states, if not more, have some mechanism for parents to homeschool. But because of the various requirements, like here in Colorado, for instance, if I wanted to homeschool Kellen, I'd have to actually submit a form to the district. And then also I would be responsible for making sure she takes the state test or bringing her in to take the state test, unless I found some other provision in terms of something analogous. All of which is to say, there's these various pieces, pretty well intended, but if you're a skeptical homeschool family, you're going to say, I don't want any of that. I'm going to stay away as far as possible. And so in this era of unique circumstances, extraordinary circumstances, this is something I think states should re-examine, especially if we're serious about making sure all of our kids are really well educated. And then finally, with pandemic pods and microschools, lots of information, news about this happening. Paul talked about this at the top of the conversation today. I mean, I would say that if you're a fan of subsidiarity and you really believe in the idea that parents should have the ultimate control over a child's education, then I mean, there's arguably nothing better than what parents are doing now, taking ownership and sort of organically forming these pods. And I would say for every person who criticizes pandemic pods and says, this is expanding inequities even further, it's opportunity hoarding at a level that we haven't seen before. For every person who says that, I think you have another person who says, well, listen, given the fact that schools are closed, parents are just acting rationally given the current circumstances. But all that to say, I would love to see more states and districts co-opt this particular reform. And what I mean by that is states and districts saying, you know what, we're going to provide a formal mechanism for parents to access pods if they don't have the means on their own to do so. And I think there definitely are things that states could do to make it easier for all parents to access this particular reform. All right, all of which is to say, as I'm wrapping here, I feel like the future of choice, I mean, those 8 were just examples, all call for, you'll see there's this common thing of blurring the lines, right? So, I mean, for example, here in Colorado, we have this sort of same back and forth arguments about, whether private schools are better than charters versus traditional. But if you look by the numbers, the largest sort of choice mechanism we have here in Colorado is within the public school system, right? So the idea that you're a student in Denver and you're going to go next door to Jeffco, you're still staying in the traditional system. The volume that happens there far exceeds what happens in terms of charters, privates, any other mechanism, but we never talk about that. So this idea that we got to expand the palette, we got to blur the lines, because frankly, parents aren't really as interested in these various silos and categories we like to talk about in education policy. much more, I think, interested in just sort of what that's. And so one idea I had for this to make this happen, because I feel like the choice argument is so, you know, it's such a hot topic. It's a topic of contention. Is that if we're serious about establishing some of these mechanisms in states, let's say, that are not as friendly with choice, I think there needs to be some ground rules and some trust established in terms of legislators across the aisle. So one idea, for instance, would be, let's say you wanted to establish some of these mechanisms, putting some sort of sunset provision in, with just the idea that, hey, listen, we recognize this is a unique period of time. Let's try something new. We're not trying to sneak something in, and let's see where we go from there. And I think for folks that are very skeptical on choice, they can look at a sunset mechanism and say, okay, this is not going to last forever. This is how we can sort of argue this on our side. And then for folks who are supportive of choice, I mean, I get the idea that if you're going to put a lot of energy in terms of a new choice bill or new choice law, like having a sunset provision isn't particularly satisfying. And what I would say to that is, what we've seen across the country is once you give parents a taste of choice, it's very hard to put that genie back in the bottle. So I think that is sort of the takeaway that choice supporters can take from that. So all of which is to say, I think when we think about choice in the era of coronavirus, like, we shouldn't think about trying to shoehorn it into the traditional policy arguments we've been having. Like, that doesn't serve our parents. I just don't think that's going to work. And I think there's a real opportunity here. And again, try to bring this conversation, my talk here full circle. Like, the longer we stay in the current situation that we are now, I think it becomes even more and more interesting, this particular conversation, even in states that you would never think would even, could consider something like this. All right, thank you. I'm going to stop right there and turn off my screen sharing if I can do that.
Thank you so much, Dale. I feel like this meeting today is just an embarrassment of riches of information for everyone. In the past, when we had the opportunity to get together, often would hold like a 2-day meeting on school choice. And I feel like we could have spent 2 days just unpacking all the information that you all have provided and really digging into it. And so I hope that you all will take this, opine on all of this, and come back to us with any thoughts, questions, and perhaps we can even facilitate another just discussion with some of our speakers about what you're hearing. We do have a quick question that has just come in, and I'll go ahead and get to that real quickly before we turn to our other panelists. This is from Representative Clow in Idaho. In Idaho, the Idaho Digital Learning Academy offers courses to all schools to supplement the option for students in schools that may have a weak subject matter. Are some states offering these types of classes to homeschool parents and students? If yes, how are they being accepted in the homeschool environment? I've been really curious about this too. And Dale, if you have the answer to that, that would be great. And any of our other experts who've joined us today, if anyone else has a thought or a response to that, feel free to jump in.
So I'm not as familiar with Idaho's particular circumstances. I know, for instance, like Florida's virtual academy, they've been sort of in this game for a while. In terms of being accepted in the homeschool environment, I think there's different ways you could read that question. I mean, from my vantage point, I feel like sort of since we've gone into emergency homeschooling, I think a lot of folks in the homeschool community have said what you're doing is not homeschooling, like it's sort of survival, and that's a whole sort of different dynamic there. From some folks, that's a semantics question, but I do think that there is this idea that when we talk about homeschooling, when we talk about remote learning, there are folks who have been doing this for a lot longer, and just the idea that the traditional systems immediately pivoting to this, and that what we're doing, we're calling it the same. There probably is something we're missing in terms of how we're describing what's actually happening across the country.
Any of our other experts, Paul or Hallie, do you have a response to that question? Want to add anything? Okay. Well, at this point, we're going to turn to Paul and Hallie, and I'm going to first ask you to spend about 5 minutes reflecting on the recommendations for policy changes or reforms that Dale just shared with us. So Paul, why don't we begin with you?
Sure. And yeah, I thought Dale's presentation was really interesting, and his white paper with AEI really lays out, I think, a really effective roadmap for policymakers to be thinking about these considerations of how to respond to COVID in these coming months, especially heading into the next year. And so I just had a few thoughts. I mean, I think, we at EdChoice and the research we do, we look at education savings accounts quite a bit and how they're being implemented in states, and how some states are considering them in their perhaps in their bills for next year, and they have, there's just a lot of variety. I mean, they've focused initially on special populations like students with special needs, military families, low-income families, but particularly it's been around the students with special needs and military family communities in Florida, Arizona, and several other states. And I think, I think the appeal and what we've learned through some of our survey work of those families who are doing or who are participating in ESA programs is that they value the flexibility and the timeliness and the kind of responsiveness that and the control of being able to direct the funds that they have within their their education savings account and direct it to whatever they would find necessary to give their child a good education, whether that's tuition at a private school or other kind of school, or particularly like online course work, therapies for students with special needs, and even tutoring. And so I think that kind of adaptability of ESAs is appealing. I think it speaks to the moment, and it really gets at coming from a choice proponent's perspective, where we see that more options for families is optimal, and I think that what we see now is that people, I think, have a whole new appreciation, even just family members, that when we get together, I think they have a different understanding of the, school choice or educational choice now, after they've have had kids or grandchildren who are going through this, the pandemic and having to pivot. And so I think that there is something, so Dale in his talk and in his white paper had ESAs as a potential policy lever that that legislators and policymakers can use to address the pandemic, and in the short term and perhaps the long term as well. And I think that's all. I think there is something to that, where it is truly like a financial mechanism for families to be able to, in a very timely, responsive way, address their kids' needs in ways that even schools and districts or other institutions, they just don't have that kind of timely response and customized kind of response, personalized response that parents can do through ESAs. So I think that there's something there, and I would just add that some folks have proposed tutoring, and how can we scale and expand tutoring. And so I think that there's something there. ESAs for being available for tutoring really can address some of those learning losses, particularly among those more disadvantaged students, or the students who are at home, doing remote learning. I mean, there are reports that some districts have, they've lost touch with 30 to 40% of the children in their school districts, and they're not sure where they are because they're not logging on. And so how can we keep those kids engaged, and how can we keep parents motivated and feel like they have some sense of control? And I think that, being able to have an ESA available to them, and to be able to flexibly use those funds, and tutoring is a way. And I mean, just speaking from our own personal experience, both of our girls have used tutors in recent years, and it has been incredibly helpful and beneficial to us. And we see some of the other our neighbors' children who take advantage of tutors. And so that there's something there where and so people are proposing some, national tutor corps, or at least at the state level, providing some special allotment, allocation of funds specifically for, elevating the supply of tutors. And so I think that there's something there perhaps on tutoring. And the last thing I would just note is I think, and Dale touched on this at the very end, there is something to the longer that we are in this, the more I suspect, and this is something we want to track in our polling, just how our attitudes changing and permanently, and having a sustained change, towards any range of choice ideas and policies and reforms, but also behaviors too. And how they're looking at pods and tutoring, will that persist because of the longer that we are in this, to use that cliche, it's like a new normal. And so it'll be interesting just to see really what happens over the next 12 to 18 months, but I better stop there and let Hallie take a turn.
Thank you. Hallie?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Thanks, Michelle, for having me. And to be honest, I get bored on Zoom calls nowadays, but this one has been very engaging. So thank you to everyone for sharing. So I just wanted to share, a quick anecdote. I live in Washington, D.C., one of many cities that's becoming pretty hard to afford living in. And so I used to work downtown in K Street in the center of D.C., what they call Lobbyist Row. A couple of years ago, my wife and I wanted to buy our first home in DC. So we bought, it's not a very big city, but we bought a house as far away from the downtown as we possibly could, because that's, what was in our budget. And so prior to the pandemic happening, maybe y'all have similar experiences. I used to either get in my car and drive for 50 minutes, 50, in rush hour every morning to work. I would sit at my desk and then drive back home 50 minutes in the car to get to my house. And to be honest, I never really thought that much about it. I even did it when I was 8 or 9 months pregnant. Sometimes I would even walk to the metro, sit on the metro for 40 minutes, and then do the same thing at the end of the day. This morning, of course, all that changed, right? I've been doing all this stuff from my basement. This morning I went to a doctor's appointment downtown, right down the street from where my office was. And I just had this feeling I was sitting in my car in a little bit of rush hour. And I thought, I'm never going to do this again. Unless I have to, I'm not getting in the car again and driving, for 2 hours a day in traffic. It's just not going to happen. I haven't told my boss that yet, but that's my take on it. And it really made me think, to what people have reiterated in different ways about this conversation today, is that now that parents and families and even kids have had a taste of something different, right? A different way of living and of learning. I don't think we can ever go back to what we did before. And I think, part of what we're all working through here in our conversation today is given that fact, there is no more status quo, the status quo is kind of gone. A, what's next? And then B, how do we as policymakers and policy thinkers, how do we support parents and families in creating a new policy environment to help them get what they want and help their kids get what they want? I have lucky enough to have two really cool second grade boys in my life. So one is my nephew, Jack, and one is my sister's friend, Ben. And so they've had pretty different responses to, being Zoom schooled or hybrid schooled. My nephew, Jack, really doesn't like it. He's a really social kid. He wants to be in gym class. He wants to be learning. He wants to be interacting with other kids. But Ben, on the other hand, he has some anxiety. He doesn't love being in class with a ton of kids. So he's really thrived in this kind of new hybrid schooling environment and having more just time at home and time to himself to learn. And I share that because, as we all know, education is very personal. And I think what a lot of families are learning, or what all of us are learning, is that there's other ways to do it besides just sending kids to school for X number of minutes a day in a brick and mortar school. One of the things that Dale mentioned in his paper, which I highly recommend reading if you just want to take a little bit more of a deeper dive, it was just, beautifully written and laid out, is one of the things he mentioned in the paper was kind of changing or seat time requirements or adding some more flexibility with regard to seat time. And even though it's not like a sexy education topic, seat time requirements, I do think it's actually going to be an important issue to focus on going forward. And it might behoove those of you who do work in state law and policy to start thinking about, like Dale said, over the next 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 years, what kind of flexibilities can we create in state law and policy so that the school isn't required to have like every single kid in a seat in a school for X number of minutes and X number of days per year. I think we're all just kind of learning pretty rapidly that it doesn't have to be that way, and it probably doesn't serve everyone for it to be that way. I'd be interested if any of the other panelists or anyone on the call at all has some thoughts about changing seat time requirements, like whether that might be, like to what extent that would be a hard lift or some maybe obstacles to doing that. I have a feeling that maybe like some teachers unions might be more opposed to that than others. So that was kind of the one piece that I wanted to add in is around the seat time requirements. And it's just kind of been on my mind as someone who's working in policy. The one last thing I'll say, Michelle, before I turn it back to you is that, so I'm the policy director for the American Federation for Children. We do school choice advocacy, both, private school choice and then charter school choice as well. And we work in a whole bunch of states. So, if you're interested in working through any of these policies and just like, having a thought partner and how to, introduce some new policies or new policy ideas in your state, me and my team would be really excited to collaborate on that, both on the political side and then on the policy side as well. And I will pause there.
Thank you. It's very interesting that you're bringing up this question about seat time and attendance in general, because I have been talking with our sister organizations, CCSSO, NASB, NGA, ECS, and we've all been trying to figure out these questions because our constituents are asking, particularly about what's happening for this year, how much time online if they're in schools or equates to a full school day, or if a state requires school hours, how does that now translate for distance learning? And so we actually are right in the process of gathering that information. We'd be happy to share that with you and with others on the call, because I do think this is going to be a big issue, and it directly links to funding, because a lot of states pretty shortly are going to start beginning their school counts this year. So how do you count, and how are schools registering whether or not a student is present? How are they measuring participation, especially if it's online, especially if it's not symmetric learning? If they're on their own during the day and just following assignments, who's checking them in for the day? So these are all questions that no one anticipated. And as you were saying, these are things that I think we're gonna begin to tackle and think about whether or not these requirements make sense. We do have a question on seat time from Pierce McNair, if there's any federal statutory or regulatory obstacles to removing seat time. Austin Reed, are you, yeah, I think you're still on the call. I hate to put you on the spot. I don't know if you have anything to add here. It is not my sense that that's the case, because every state does do it a little bit differently. It's my sense that that is a state-by-state requirement, but Austin, feel free to add to the conversation if you have any different information or anything to add.
I had to grab my headphones. That's my understanding as well, but we could get a more of a firm confirmation on that, but I'm not familiar with any policies that would directly pose an obstacle.
I would guess not, because there are some states who've already changed the requirements this year via statute or through state board regulation. So we know that some states, I think it's Indiana, Illinois, possibly Indiana. I'm not 100% sure. If there's anyone on from Indiana, if you want to jump in Maryland, are states that have come to mind who I know have been addressing this, particularly through state board action, saying, for example, 3.5 to 4 hours of online learning equates to a day of attendance for students who are in a virtual setting. They're trying to address those sorts of things. Okay, we are going to now pivot to some questions that we had from the audience real quickly before we need to wrap up. We had a question about the role of Khan Academy in this setting, and we all know that, at least for my household, it's our favorite go-to tutor. It is the tutor our children have, and it's the tutor that the parents in the household have as well. And so just wondering if our speakers have anything to add about the role of Khan Academy in this particular setting for all students who are either in traditional public schools, charter schools, or homeschooling.
So I haven't been following. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Paul.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, like, I haven't been following Khan really closely, like you, Michelle. You know, Khan also sort of tutor for my daughter last spring. I know they've done a lot of work recently in terms of, you know, trying to establish like even a more formalized mechanism, so a parent can just pick it up and actually sort of really almost like follow a daily schedule. They've been doing a lot of work on this front. So that's, you know, that's sort of the extent of my knowledge on that piece. But Paul, maybe you had another angle on this here.
You know, we did a kind of a rapid response survey just among private schools in April, and one of the questions we asked were just all the different kinds of platforms and online services and providers that private schools are trying to tap into as they are putting together on the fly curriculum and coursework. And Khan Academy was if I recall, I can't remember the exact percentage, but like there was a pretty substantial percentage of private schools reporting that they were utilizing Khan Academy. And I think that, and I believe that there might be some others who have looked at this even in different other sectors, among public charter schools or public district schools too. So.
You know, one advantage, particularly for middle or high school students, is that once you start taking the PSAT, Khan Academy works directly with College Board to align your tests and particularly your deficiencies of where you need to perhaps focus more. And each student, after they take the PSAT, gets sort of a customized idea of what they could be doing through Khan Academy that could improve those PSAT or eventually SAT scores. And it's meant as a way to equalize access to preparation for SAT. Okay, any last burning questions? If you have one, just feel free to unmute yourself and ask. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. This has been a fantastic conversation. Again, just so much amazing information that was shared here. We really, really appreciate it. We will follow up with a recording of this, recording so that you can revisit it or share it with your colleagues if you'd like. And we will also follow up with a long list of resources. Benjamin has been adding some, our speakers have been adding some. It looks like Pat McCracken has added a resource that he has learned about from Washington State. And we know that others have just been adding information into the chat box. So we really appreciate all your participation. We appreciate the expertise that was shared by your speakers. And thank you for your time, and let us know if you have any additional follow-up questions. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you all.